we're ready, huh? Okay. I'm glad I put it on note cards today. Usually I have a legal pad and everything, but this will work great. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm a retired teacher. I taught American history for 32 years, the vast majority of it in Waynesboro. Taught mostly AP American, AP US history, and also about the last 15 years of my career, I taught state and local history. We were fortunate enough in the local school district to have senior electives and a whole series of electives, and the students could take whatever. So there's some reason they took state and local history, and that's really where I first became real familiar with the Battle of Monterey Pass and what took place. And I think there's some reasons it's been overlooked. Briefly, what I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to really quick talk about our museum, how we got there. And I don't know if you all are familiar with it or not, but please, 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 and I always tell everybody, the only thing it costs you is your time. And we're open Saturdays and Sundays from 10 to 4. We're all volunteers, so there's no professional kind of people there, but the docents do a really good job, and like I said, it's well worth your time, I think. The other thing I'd like to do is, and I'm going to not necessarily do the battle. I'd like to do the characters there. One of the things I always thought when I taught history was, history's made up of people. It's not made up of somebody moving two feet in this direction and shooting 2 shots and moving over here and shooting 3 more. Although I'll, obviously if I'm going to talk about the characters, I'm going to incorporate the battle itself. But it's not going to be a blow by blow of the battle. And what I'd also like to do is look at kind of who came before the battle through the pass, who came during the battle, and who came after the battle. And if any of you are familiar with Jacob Stoner, his writings, Jacob Stoner was a historian in Waynesboro in the 1930s and 40s. He was actually a bank president, but he wrote a series of, I think, 360 some weekly installments in the Record Herald on local history. And one of the continuing installments was he talked about going up 16 towards Gettysburg. He talked about all the characters and what happened and everything. And he spends a lot of time on Monterey Pass. So I think I'm following in Jacob's footsteps a little bit in terms of this presentation. I hope I can do it half as good as he could. How the museum got there, and I'm just going to do this real quick. Obviously, the museum's there because of the battle. The battle was fought on July 4th and July 5th of 1863. It was a major battle on the retreat from Gettysburg. And we all know Gettysburg, but we know Lee was faced with the most difficult task that any commander might have, and that's extracting the defeated army, essentially from enemy territory. Now, Lee chose 2 routes. One of the routes was basically 30 and then cut down about where the Rudders is now on 30. They're at Greenwood, they called it, and they avoided Chambersburg and then went down 11. That was the longest route. Only about 1/3 of the army went down that route. But there is an account in one of Ted, if you guys are familiar with Ted Alexander, who was chief historian at Antietam for years, wrote extensively about Monterey Pass and local battles. He wrote a book called When the War Passed This Way, and he chronicles an account of a young girl in a farmhouse on the retreat route from 30 and 11 down, where the train, mostly wounded, passed 36 consecutive hours. And she talks about hearing the wounded and all the horrible sounds and things like that. The other shortest route to Williamsport, and Williamsport is where Lee hopes to get back across the river into home territory, is from Gettysburg to Fairfield. Those of you who are familiar, Iron Springs Road, which was the shortest route, to what is called Mariah Furnace Road at the time. Now, if you're familiar with the area at all, it's Iron Springs Road, and you go to Gum Springs Road, and then when Gum Springs Road kind of turns down and becomes Furnace Road, if you go straight there into the woods, you can kind of see it's a driveway now. That's still the original Mariah Furnace Road. And that actually comes out down at Brown Springs, where the old swimming pool used to be, if anybody remembers that. Brown Springs, where the pavilion is. They have a little pavilion. It's now part of our holdings, so it skirts the other side of the mountain. And I'll be honest with you, it's one of my favorite parts of the whole museum. We own about 116 acres that we control back there. And you walk back about quarter to a half mile, and on the left is D.L. George's property, and on the right is ours, and then the road bears an angle to the right. And from that point to where you get to Old Furnace Road, it's absolutely pristine. It's absolutely, last time it was used was the 1890s. And it is, I'm a history geek, I'll tell you that, but it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I get there, because you can just see it. The ruts are there, and you can just imagine how difficult it must have been for them. So obviously, that's the route the Confederates are taking on July 4th and July 5th. And they will be intersected by Union cavalry led by Kilpatrick, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. How we got here, again, Jacob Stoner is really after the battle, this is kind of forgotten because it's Gettysburg, 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 Gettysburg. But remember, the Battle of Monterey Pass is fought in 2 states. It's fought on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. It's fought in 4 counties. It is the longest continuous battle of the Civil War in terms of mileage. And it's the second largest battle, obviously, in Pennsylvania. But it's not until the 30s when Jacob Stoner begins to write about it. And one of the things he says is every school child ought to take, in Franklin County, ought to take a trip up to Monterey Pass. It's that important. Now, unfortunately, Stoner dies in the 1940s. He actually goes to Johns Hopkins for a fairly simple operation and dies on the operating table. His widow will publish a history after his death. And if you get an opportunity to see it or purchase it at a sale or an auction, do it. It's wonderful, wonderful reading. So he's the first champion. And then after he passes away, it kind of falters a little bit. 1963, 100th year anniversary, there's a little bit of revival. And many of you might have seen it. I would think the library probably has a copy of this. It's a small little pamphlet published by the Record Herald called 15 Days Under the Confederacy. If you ever get a chance to look at that, it chronicles the Battle of Monterey Pass, plus a lot of local things in Waynesboro, what went on at the time. And I think, I would bet the library has a copy.
We can see after this.
Yeah. And again, 100 years, and if you guys remember, we did the 150th year a couple years ago, and now it's kind of fading into the past. Same thing happened at the 100 years. And then in the 1990s, a young couple, John and Alicia Miller. John wrote extensively for the Emmitsburg Historical Society, and if you want to Google him in Emmitsburg, his stuff is still online. It's a great historian, great historian. John and Alicia, and John was writing, they lived in Fountaindale, almost near where the firehouse is. And so John's doing all this writing about the Civil War and the battle and everything, and all of a sudden it kind of occurs to him, he's like, well, holy man, it's right here. I'm living right where it's at. He started to put up a series of signs at his own expense and his own time, and put up a series of signs. Now, John and Alicia both are integral pieces of why the museum's here. They're kind of like one of the first real pushes. In the early 2000s, the state of Michigan, their Civil War Roundtable, petitioned Washington Township to put up a sign to put up a sign for General Custer. That's going to click again. I'm sorry, I apologize. There we go. Put up a sign for General Custer. Their only stipulation was they would not put it up on private property. It had to be public property. Well, and I would say, for once, elected officials put 2 and 2 together, and they came up with 4. Because the property where our museum is was owned by a lady named Ray Cantwell. I don't know if anybody knew Ray. Yeah, and she was a mover and a shaker. Yeah. And she absolutely knew her history. Mm-hmm. She knew what happened there. And periodically, and if you guys know John Gorman, I think John was the township supervisor at the time, she would come down and she would badger the supervisors, like, do you know what you have here? You ought to be taking advantage of this. You ought to be developing this, et cetera, et cetera. Well, like I said, they put 2 and 2 together and were like, holy man, maybe we ought to put the sign there. And that's really how our organization began. And it began as a subcommittee for Washington Township, but then in 2006 we became, or excuse me, 2011, we, 2011 we became the Friends of Monterey Past Battlefield and Park, and I'm on the board of that, obviously. By 2015, our museum opens, and a great sidelight here. When Miss Cantwell first sold us the property, we went and looked at it. Many of you remember there was a mobile home and a foundation that sat there. Now, I've lived up here for 28 years, and I drove every day to school and that, looked at that. What I never realized is, beside that, kind of overgrown, was a mountain stone handmade pavilion. And when we looked at it, beside the pavilion was a pillar about that high and had a plaque dedicated to a young Marine, Brubaker. Yes, who was killed in Vietnam. And his father built that out of catharsis, out of, just trying to, I guess, occupy his time and sorrow and everything. Well, when we saw the pavilion, we thought, boy, that would be great to use it, but it was, had big cracks in it, it's disrepair, had no plumbing, little electricity. I had to go like this to get in the door. It wasn't going to meet code for anything. But every stone from that pavilion is on the outside of our museum. And there's a plaque. We rededicated the plaque to Sergeant Brubaker. And actually, when we did that, his cousin from New Jersey came up and helped with it. And a lot of members of his unit, they actually took an etching of his name from the wall and gave us and we display that. Usually we put it outside by the plaque with the Marine Corps flag. If the weather's decent at all, we do that. And that's, boy, sometimes you do things that are right, and that was the right thing to do with that.
I think, if I remember right, he went to Vietnam, and then he came home, and then he went back, and then he came home, and then I think he went back again, and then that's when.
If I remember what I read
times,
correctly, I think he did 2 tours.
Was
so,
it 2?
but he might have come home for,
Yeah.
to come home. But I could be wrong about that. Yeah. 2017, we've purchased 116 acres, and we do have trails and interpretive signage over there on the trails. And in 2021, our representative Schimmel was very instrumental. We now have it looks like a daggone road that you can take to Monterey Peak, and it's a good walk.
I walked up it.
Yes,
I'm
he did.
95 years old.
Uh,
So it can be
Congratulations on
done.
both accounts, being 95 and walking.
It can be done.
It has an observation deck. It has the viewfinder glasses up there. Somebody said to me, do you think they know at Fort Ritchie? Because you can see the gate at Fort Ritchie, the door and all that from there. He said, do you think they know? I said, well, I'm pretty sure they know. And it's also, if people have mobility issues, part of the grant, we also have a golf cart that will take people up there. So if anybody wants to go up, just stop at the museum or hit our Facebook page, and we'll make arrangements to make that happen. So that's where we are today. Our hopes are to be able to eventually purchase the toll house, which is over here on Old 16. The toll house is where the breakthrough of the battle actually took place. And a gentleman's holding it for us right now, and we have another property that somebody else is holding. It's just a matter of finding the money to do it. All right, let's get to part 2 now. And that's just the characters of who passes through the pass and what they're kind of like a little bit. Obviously pre-battle, as early as 1747, there's a road there, documented road. And very quickly, the pass becomes part of what is called the Great Wagon Road, or the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, that led from Philadelphia through Lancaster, what becomes York, and then down the Shenandoah Valley, eventually as far south as northern Georgia and parts of Alabama, but most of the Carolinas. And it's basically the Scots-Irish that take the first trip. I read a book years ago called The Brothers' War, and it speculated that even presidents like Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk, that their families probably took the Great Wagon Road to the south. As early as 1775, a Presbyterian minister on a mission, Philip Vickers Vivian, actually chronicles in a book shortly thereafter called The Travels of Philip Vickers Vivian. He actually stays at Monterey Pass. He stays at a house at the top. He's not very complimentary of of the people that put him up and the food he got and everything like that. But that's probably the earliest that I know written that says there was a hospitality at the top of Monterey Pass. And we all know this, this is a big hospitality area for years and years and years and years. Right before the battle, in June of 1863, when the Confederates are threatening this area, a lot of Waynesborians will evacuate. One of the most interesting stories is the chief teller of the bank in Waynesboro at the time. There's only one. His name's John Phillips. And if anybody's into like local Waynesboro industrial history, after the war he becomes a big player in Landis Tool, Landis Machine, and even an investor in Frick Company at one point in time. Phillips will take all the money out of the bank, all the bank's assets, put it in his baggage, and will retreat over the pass. He stops at the Monterey House for dinner, and there's a troop of cavalry unit of Confederates that are threatening it, and he doesn't even finish his dinner, and he gets out. He goes to Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and waits out the battle until the Confederates evacuate Waynesboro, comes back with every cent that he took out. So, you probably want to have this guy. He's probably a good guy to have in your investment. He's certainly trustworthy.
Man, how about
Yeah.
that?
And if you all remember, a number of years ago in Burns Hill Cemetery, where I think there were 2 young guys that got up and destroyed a bunch of the monuments and stuff. The one that had it was a big angel with wings. They broke the wings off. That's John Phillips's gravestone right there. So, and the last person I want to talk about before the battle is actually Waynesboro's own, the only Medal of Honor winner in Franklin County, a member of the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry Company G, Henry Bonebrake. Henry Bonebrake was born near Roadside, and he joins as a cavalry unit. He's part of Buford's cavalry, and we all know that Buford's cavalry fights day 1. If you go to the Peace Light in Gettysburg, their monument is right down from the Peace Light, the 17th. They are on the far right flank on day 1 at Gettysburg. And I was just telling my kids at school, if you're a general, the last thing you want to do is get flanked, so you put your best people on the flank. So I think that tells you something about the 17th Pennsylvania. He will win the Medal of Honor at Five Forks late in the war. And he's an interesting guy. He storms the defensive position of the Confederates and captures an enemy flag. His Medal of Honor reads that through superior strength and ability, he's able to capture a flag. Now, one of the things we have in the museum, and as far as in the museum, it's probably my favorite thing. It's the least aesthetically pleasing thing we have. It's a diary. It's a diary. If you've ever seen those Civil War diaries, they're about like that. They usually have a leather or a kind of a heavy oilcloth front to it. We have his diary from in the fall of 1864 till he gets back to Greencastle on June 16th of 1865. And I've had the opportunity to read it. When he wins the Medal of Honor, all he says is, he chronicles who was shot, who was wounded in his unit, and all he says is, I was fortunate enough to capture an enemy flag. Never says another word in his diary the whole time about it. Never. He is in Washington when Lincoln is assassinated. Secretary of War Stanton brought all the Medal of Honor winners together. A lot of them wanted for capturing flags, and they were all going to present them to Lincoln in a ceremony and etc. So they were all there. And he, in his diary, talks about Lincoln being assassinated, the chaos in the city, talks about waiting in line and viewing the body. And in fact, he will even get up in the morning that they're putting Lincoln on the train. Remember, they take Lincoln to Philadelphia, New York, Harrisburg. They do the big tour with his body. And he even gets up to see Lincoln off on the train. And he becomes very much a staple in Waynesboro afterwards. He's buried at Green Hill Cemetery, going outside of Waynesboro on the left. And one interesting story, I got to tell you this. He's with Buford. They go through the pass and they camp near Fountaindale. Now remember, Fountaindale today is about 1.5 miles west of where it was then for some reason. So they're camping down along the stream, and the men of Company G ask Buford if they can ride over the mountain to go home and visit their family. And Buford says, you can, but you all have to promise to be back here for muster in the morning. Every one of them's back in the morning. Every one of them. Now, during the battle, and I'm going to try to do this a little bit with Union and Confederate. I'm going to try to introduce the battle a little bit. The first player we ought to probably talk about is Judson Kilpatrick, nicknamed Kill Cavalry. He's the head of the Union Cavalry. They are coming from Emmitsburg, and the road at the time is Old 16. New 16, as we call it, was built in the 1930s. It was a New Deal project. So the Charmian Road or Old 16, that's the route they're taking from Emmitsburg. Now Kilpatrick's an interesting character. Graduates from West Point in 1861. The first class in 1861. There's actually 2 classes that graduate in 1861. Custer is in the second class. Dead last in his class, I might add. Kilpatrick is the first officer shot wounded during the Civil War. He was wounded in June of 1861. I'm going to put this as delicately as I can, but as truthful as I can. He's a womanizer. He's a drinker. At one point in time, he's arrested for corruption. His camps are noted for having ladies of the night being there all the time. And one historian said his greatest ability was the ability to ingratiate himself to people who could improve his career. But the one thing he will do, he has no compunction at all about sending people into battle. And if anybody's familiar with the third day at Gettysburg, he pretty much sends Farnsworth to his death. It's, you know, some of Farnsworth's men said he was guilty of murder in that case.
Well, he shamed Farnsworth.
Yeah.
He shamed him.
Exactly. But he'll fight. And in many respects, maybe the guy that they needed at the time, to be quite honest with you. He later will become ambassador to Chile. He will marry into the Vanderbilt family. And Anderson Cooper, well, let's put it this way. Kilpatrick is Anderson Cooper's 2 or 3 times great-grandfather. And if you ever see a picture of him, and I kind of look at it and I think, yeah, I can kind of see that, but maybe it's just because I know that. I'm not sure. His contemporary on the other side is just as interesting a character. It's General William Grumble Jones, nicknamed Grumble, and he earned it from everything I've ever been, read and researched. He was temperamental, he was grouchy, he was nasty, and he was very blunt about things. Not very well. Stewart hated him. But Stewart seemed to hate a lot of people. So, but I always tell everybody, you got to give Grumble Jones a pass. Graduates from West Point in 1848. He's being stationed in West Texas, which at that time was Indian territory. He and his new bride are on a ship off the Galveston coast, and a storm comes up suddenly. Literally, his new bride is swept from his arms, and she drowns. So I always tell everybody, you can call him Grumble and all that kind of stuff. Maybe he has a reason to be that way. During the battle, he's in charge of the Confederate forces, and the battle gets so close at one time, and you guys, you people who are historians, you understand generals don't fight very often. He actually drops down in the ranks with all his aides and anybody wounded or whatever, and they enter the battle. And he tells his men, he said, "Don't call me general, call me Bill," because he's afraid of being singled out and shot or captured. He gets separated from his troops somewhere over near the toll house and wanders around Washington County and probably parts of Washington Township for about 36 hours till he finally finds his way back to Williamsport, and he will head the defenses at Williamsport until Lee gets there. So he's very accomplished. He's just, you know, always told the kids history is just timing. Sometimes you're the right person at the right place at the right time. Sometimes it works the other way. For him, it probably worked the other way. George Armstrong Custer is here. He's just been freshly anointed or appointed general. He's leading the Michigan troops, the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Michigan Cavalry. When he took command, we have a diagram where one of the soldiers said he looked more like a circus rider in his dress than he looked like a general. And again, he's almost Kilpatrick's, what they call it, doppelganger or whatever. They're like twins almost. He'll fight. He's rash. He's brave. He doesn't make good decisions all the time, but he will fight. During the battle, he's actually thrown off a horse. Down by the bridge, if you know where our museum, that little bridge over Red Run right there, that's the first focal point of real contention. He's actually thrown off a horse near there, and a sergeant comes in and swoops him up and saves him, and obviously saves him for, 14 years later when the Sioux get him or whatever. So, but I think one of the big draws for us at the museum is we get a lot of Custer people that come through, because he's one of those figures in history where he seems to have a following, let's put it that way. Custer's contemporary on the other side is a real interesting cat. George Malcolm Emack, or Emick. His family pronounces it Emack because we've actually had some of his family here. He's a captain at the time. He's head of the 2nd Maryland Cavalry Company B. He will fire the first shots of the battle. He will have one cannon, and he actually appropriates the cannon. A guy named Tanner, who got lost, actually, was supposed to be with the other retreat route, ends up on this one. He's got a cannon, and there's some contention of how many shots he has. Emack claims he only has 2 in his limber, but a lot of other historians claim he had 5. Okay, so we're not quite sure. He sets the cannon in the middle of the road. If you guys know where Holly Presbyterian Church is, right going down the road towards the grit mill, right there. That's where that's where the first shots of the Battle of Monterey Pass are fired. Kilpatrick's coming up the road. Emack's cannon fires. Now you know the elevation there, so the cannon can't quite get elevated, and it fires over the top of their head. But it scares the bejesus out of the Union Army. Now you remember, it's 9 o'clock, it's getting dark, it's in the midst of, and I always tell everybody, a south central Pennsylvania thunderstorm.
I like what we have today.
Yeah, we all know what that's like. Only this thing seems to last all night for some reason. And it scares them, they fall back. Kilpatrick will claim a quarter mile, Emack claims a mile that they fall back. And you'll see this all the time in official records, and I always just tell my kids, the winners write history when you get right down to it. So there always seems to be some contention. Well, Emack will then charge downhill. Some historians, in fact, in this book, claims he only has 25 people, and that's John Miller's book. Emack, in his book, in his accounts, says he has 200 to 250. So I'll go with Emack in his account when it comes to that. They charge downhill, and they disrupt the Union cavalry for a period of time. Emack previously, early in the war, he was a spy. And he actually gets captured as a spy and stabs his captor to death and escapes. From there, he becomes an interrogator at Libby Prison. And you can actually go and find some documents where some of the Union prisoners, they don't have very nice things to say about Emack. He will spend most of the war as a captain of the 2nd Maryland. And he is actually, after the war, we all lived through the Kennedy assassination and all the theories and the conspiracy theories and all that. Emack's actually implicated in a couple of the conspiracy theories for the assassination of Lincoln. At Monterey, at the Battle of Monterey, he is wounded 5 different times. Both arms, one hand, his right hand, his left knee, and his right leg. And we actually have, and if you want to take a look at it later, I'll be glad to show it to you. but we have a copy of a letter from his family, and he talks about being wounded and all that kind of thing. And he uses an expression I never heard. He said at one time, "I thought I was about to go up the spout." I've never heard that expression before in my life or since. He will fight. At first, they will retreat back to near where the Monterey house is. And if you guys are familiar at all, Monterey house is about where the first green of the golf course is, that whole area around there, the whole area of the Monterey circle and everything. That was all Monterey house property. They will retreat back to there. And by that point in time, Kilpatrick has, remember, he's gotten the cavalry, they're starting to flank. That means they're off their horses for the most part. And you reduce your troops then, because for every 3 men that fight, one guy has to hold the horses. But they threaten and flank Emac, and he has to withdraw. And he makes his stand basically about halfway between where Monterey Lane is now, towards the bridge behind the museum. That's the most intense fighting of the battle. It will last from about 12 o'clock to about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then that's where we will see the next character, Major Charles Capehart. Capehart is born in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. He lives in Illinois when the war starts out. And by the time we get here, he is the head of the 1st West Virginia Cavalry. Now remember, West Virginia just became a state in 1863, or in June of 1863. So previous to that, they called themselves the Virginia Cavalry. He will receive a Medal of Honor for his actions here. He is actually the man that charges once the bridge behind the museum is secured. And they will actually, believe it or not, a guy will crawl out on the bridge, and he's ordered by a Michigan guy named Alger. And Alger ends up becoming Secretary of War during the Spanish-American War. They crawl out on the bridge to make sure it's secure. Michigan troops will get around, and then they'll establish positions right across the bridge. The Confederates by that time are at the toll house, and Capehart will order his men on a cavalry saber charge only. He said, if anybody shoots, I'm going to run them through with my sword, because they were worried about shooting each other. It was so dark and chaos. He will break through the Confederates at toll house, and he will begin to destroy the wagons the whole way down from the toll house, the whole way down to Rouserville. One of the interesting things about him is his brother also earns a Medal of Honor. And I didn't know this until I started to do some research. There's 7 sets of brothers that have earned Medals of Honor in our history. Not so much his contemporary, but kind of an interesting character also on the Confederate side is a gentleman named John Alexander Harmon. John Alexander Harmon is one of 5 brothers who fight in the war. Born in Waynesboro, Virginia, not Pennsylvania. He is chief quartermaster, originally with Stonewall Jackson. Now, if you know anything about Stonewall Jackson, he's pious. He doesn't swear. He ate butter once in his life and decided not to do it again because it tasted so good. He knew it was a sin. Yeah, chewed lemons in battle. Well, Harmon is about the polar opposite. He's a large, profane man. And evidently, every time he'd swear around Jackson, he'd get reprimanded. But by the time Gettysburg rolls around, of course, Jackson has died, and he's now Ewell's quartermaster general. Harmon has chops. He was in charge of the organization to get the Confederate Army out of Antietam, so he knows what to do. He is legendary among the troops for his ability to swear. And 2 quotes. One quote from one of his men said, he could excite the admiration of the most scientific mule driver.
That's bad.
And they also said, the best swearing drivers were well below the major standards. Harmon's the one that organizes the retreat, which wagons go when and how they go and everything. And there's a story that Ewell and he are in Fairfield. And Ewell looks at Harmon and says, get these wagons back to Williamsport or I never want to see your face again. And I always told everybody, unfortunately, Harmon's response is lost to history. And maybe it's fortunate that his response was lost to history. before I finish up, I do want to mention there are two locals that play a very important role at the pass. One is Charles Berman, a young farmer. His farm was down over the hill, close to where the grit mill was. He will lead the 1st Vermont Cavalry, and they will go over, there's two arguments here, one Harbaugh Valley Road or two Monterey Lane. And out through what is now Fort Ritchie and working around and come down into Smithsburg. They're trying to flank the wagon train. When they get to Smithsburg, there's no wagon train there. So Berman says to them, absolutely, they've got to be in Leitersburg. So he leads the 1st Vermont Cavalry to Leitersburg, and they're there. And they start destroying wagons back this way. Berman will actually have a harrowing escape experience. He's somewhere up here, and he uses terms about being in a cherry orchard and all this and that. And he finally escapes, and he gets back to his house, and the Confederates are chasing him. And he actually drops his horse, runs through his house, gets on another horse, and goes back and hides in the woods until the Confederates are done. And the other, and in many ways my favorite, is a young girl, 17 years old. Some people claim she was only 12, but if you do, we've done some genealogical research. She was 17 at the time. Hetty Zeilinger, Henrietta Zeilinger. They lived, her and her mother and two sisters. Her father had already died. Her brother was probably in the war, we think, with an Ohio unit, believe it or not. But they lived almost right across from where the entrance to the grit mill is. That was their farm, almost right there. You can see it on the 1858 maps. She will lead a contingency of Michigan troops up what now is Furnace Road. Now, Furnace Road at that time was just a farm lane. And what they were trying to do is when you get up to the top of Furnace Road, that's called Fairfield Gap for some reason, and Monterey Pass is over here. They were trying to also get between the Confederates at Fairfield Gap and squeeze them together and take care of them there. One of the most interesting things we have at the museum, she will marry a Fitz. And we have a donation by a lady who was married to a Fitz who passed away. And there was a shotgun that is, and we did some research, it was either Belgium or German made, about 1840 to 1860. It has what most experts have looked at and said is a field repair on it. The story was Hetty Zeilinger's son was raking leaves around the Fitz house, which was just on Old 16, not too far up from the museum. He was raking leaves and found this shotgun. It has a star on it. Some people say it's aligned like the Star of Texas, and you can tell it was added later. I don't know about that, and I'm not sure about, but it's a great story, and it's certainly connected to Hetty no matter what. So it's one of our neatest things also. Excuse me? We have it hanging on the wall,
I
yeah.
saw it the other day.
Yeah. And after the battle, just a few people I want to mention real quick. If you've seen the movie Gettysburg and the British observer Fremantle, he actually writes a book. He comes through here. He talks about spending some time in a house up here. We think it might be the toll house, but he never identifies it as such. And talks about there are two dead Union soldiers there and a couple wounded in the house. Now, we know there were Confederate soldiers. Two of them died in the toll house. They buried them across the road, and then in the 1870s, they reinterred them down in the Confederate cemetery in Richmond. But he talks about that, and he talks about the devastation and losing the wagons and everything, so he chronicles this. And obviously, Robert E. Lee. Lee will come through the pass on July 6th. And everybody always says to me, who won the battle? Well, Kilpatrick destroys about 1,500, or captures or kills about 1,500 people, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 or so wagons. And they will actually push them together, most of the captured ones, down by Ringgold, and burn them because they're in enemy territory by the time it breaks out. The infantry has already come up, and if you know, cavalry's no match for the infantry long term. And Kilpatrick's actually forced to abandon the toll house by about 7 o'clock in the morning. So if you look at it, the Confederates needed to hold the pass to get back into Virginia, and they did. There was a brief period of time when they didn't, but overall they did. Lee, on the afternoon of July 6th, actually will come through the pass. Now, some of you are familiar with John Howard McClellan, the author, wrote a couple books here, and since his passed. In his last book called A River to Cross, he talks about them Lee stopping at the Benshoff house. We just talked about it. And if you look back there, that bridle on, or bit on the far left came from that property. If you guys are familiar, it's the one up Furnace Road on your right, a real pretty stone house that was redone a number of years ago. Real pretty property. That's supposedly the ladies were out having tea, and Lee stopped and had tea with them, according to John Howard McClellan. He also talks about Lee's Rock, and he says, and I'll tell you where that comes from. John Howard McClellan was friends with a gentleman named Taylor's grandson. Taylor was Lee's aide-de-camp, and Taylor summered up here for years after the battle. And supposedly, old Taylor took his grandson and said, right there's the rock where General Lee stood, and watched the troops pass by. Now, there's two rocks that would fit that description. If you go past the toll house and just start there, there's a rock, and then a little bit further there's another rock. We're not sure which one it is, and I keep saying we ought to just put a sign in the middle and point arrows in both directions.
Take a choice.
And Lee actually will he will go to the square in Waynesboro, and there's a great story there. He stops at the square, there's a pump still there, and they're watering the horses and getting a drink, and all of a sudden a guy comes out of the balcony of a house in Waynesboro, runs down and runs up to Lee, and of course all his aides and everybody there, they pull their sabers, they pull their guns. It was a gentleman who had served under Lee in the Mexican War. And they chat a bit, and then of course they both, Lee has to be on his way. But so that's absolutely documented that Lee came through the pass. Also ate at Steffi's Tavern. If you guys remember where Steffi's Tavern was. Steffi's Tavern was that real old, beautiful brick house that they pushed down for, it's now Buchanan on it, the old part, used to be Dean Hebb's. They pushed down a beautiful property there. That was Steffi's Tavern. And Lee, there's documents of him eating there also. And finally, the last person I want to talk about that passed through, and this is my personal, a gentleman named Taylor, who was the general of the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. He was born and raised near my hometown. And when I was a kid, I'd play, there was a huge cemetery where he's buried at Big Stone and everything. And there was empty part of the cemetery. We used to play pickup baseball there when I was a kid. He came through the pass. Now, he's later. He's with the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. They would come through Waynesboro, and they would do a lot of fighting down in Washington County. When he passed away, he had bought 3 surplus cannons and had them melted down and had his casket made out of these 3 surplus cannons. When they went to put him in, he hadn't taken into account the size of his hat. So he had to put his hat on his chest, and he was dressed in Civil War stuff. And one of his old men said, I bet the old general didn't like that very much. Now, he's 80-some years old when he died. I can't imagine his soldiers carrying him, and I don't know who the heck carried him. But they're characters. And again, I would always tell my kids, and I truly strongly believe it, that history is made by people. And for the most part, they function at extraordinary times and in extraordinary ways. But when you get right down to it, they're just like you and I. They're quirkish. They've got their own idiosyncrasies. Some of them are a little crazier than others. And then the more I think we know about those characters in history, the more I think we understand it. I'll be glad to try to answer any questions. I know I didn't do the battle. I hope nobody came here hoping to get the full battle, but we invite you to the museum. It's, again, well worth your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad to answer any questions if anybody might have some. Okay. Thank you very much.